Welcome back to the second part of Checkpoint right here on KTN. Now, apparently, the Jubilee is back in the international market. That is the Jubilee government to borrow cash as debate rages on Kenya's rising debt burden. The International Monetary Fund, well known as the IMF, has already warned Kenya is slowly moving towards unsustainable and economically dangerous debt levels. Is the country overborrowing? That is the main question tonight. And in studio, I'm joined by two individuals here who are experts when it comes to matters economy. I have Kwame Owino, who's the CEO, Institute of Economic Affairs. I also have Johnson Derry, who's he's a financial and economic analyst. I almost mentioned the other title. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the show. Now, Kwame, let me begin with you. Apparently, Kenya has just received the sum of amount I've already mentioned, 200 billion shillings.
Yes.
Now, that has raised Kenya's debt, according to records, to GDP ratio to 56%.
Okay.
There's some economists who are saying that might rise to 60%. So it's normally recommended that countries maintain at least 50%, that is GDP to debt ratio. So the main question is Kenya overborrowing?
Well, let's start with the usual caveat, which is what government says, that borrowing on its own is not a bad thing. What you spend the money on is what should concern us.
Yeah.
I mean, where we are today, I think we should be concerned for the fact that we are continuing to borrow, but the reasons for which we are borrowing. If you look at it, and the prospectus, or rather the rationale that was used to justify this borrowing, part of it is basically to invest in new things, but we're actually using this to redeem other debt. In other words, we are borrowing from Paul to pay Peter. And the terms of the borrowing are such that we are actually taking less favorable terms, which means that we actually have gained nothing from switching one form of debt to another. So this debt swap has not given us an advantage. If you take all those two together, with the fact that, yes, our debt tenure has been smaller, of course, there's a claim that it's been stretched right now, all those tell you that we must have an alert. It's clear that we would soon be above our heads in terms of how much we are borrowing and whether we are able to pay.
Johnson, do you agree with Kwame that apparently the government is borrowing to pay other debts? And what does this mean to Kenya's economy?
Well, of course, I agree largely with what he said. The issue is the use of the debt.
Yes.
We've got some $750 million to pay back, which I think were taken in around 2015. Is coming due, so that needs to be paid. Even on itself, refinancing is typically not a bad thing, if you're getting better terms, or if your asset, the cash flows from the asset you're financing, are coming towards the end of the debt. So so there's a life cycle of the asset. And you're hoping that at the end of the life, cycle, or at the beginning of its productive cycle, at some point, the value of the asset will exceed the cost of the debt. What I think concerns me is that whatever we are said to have been investing in is not delivering in terms of value vis-a-vis cost. So over time, we are beginning to we are paying for something that we can't see. That is not delivering tax revenues, because that's one of the things that ought to happen. Is that when production when you invest, production improves, and that improvement of production is supposed to deliver more tax revenues, which is supposed to cover for the increased spending. So we're not seeing any of that.
We're going to talk about KRA shortly and whether they've succeeded in collecting revenue or not. But Kwame, can you perhaps break it down for Kenyans? How bad is it? Because according to records, again, if you break down this debt, every Kenyan has a debt of about, is it 100,000 shillings?
Okay, well, that's one way to see it, but really not. Because if you simply take the amount of debt that we owe today, slightly more than $40 billion, and you split it by the number of Kenyans, then it comes to 100,000. But the problem is that not the entire 100,000 is due today. Some of it, as you've heard from the new debt, would be payable in 30 years. So it's a little smaller than that. The problem, though, is that the interest payments upon them. And as Johnson has just stated, we borrowed this money to invest. And the argument in 2014, when we took the first Eurobond, was that we were going to invest it, and by now we should have been seeing that burst of growth. If we had had that growth, we would not have had first to renegotiate a debt, and even if to renegotiate on terms that are worse than what we did 3 years ago. So that tells you already that something is wrong. So we are at the point where we are shuffling debt. Remember, the debt that we are talking about right now, the 2 billion that was concluded by Treasury on Friday,
the 200 billion.
Yes, $2 billion, which is 200 billion, yes, 200 million, 200 billion Kenya shillings that was concluded on Friday. Part of it is already spoken for. So it is not as if we infused 200 billion into our accounts. Some of it is money that we are just going to have to cut out and send to whoever we need to send. Some of it is going to tide us over because government is in a serious financial position. It's no secret that there are payments the government needs to make, including certain payments that are due even to members of parliament that are not being made. Why? Because there's insufficient cash flow. So when that money comes, you're going to use it to resolve liabilities that exist. And then when the new budget year comes, we'll still be at the same place. So it's not going to place us in a way where what we had wanted to see is for us to shrink our budget deficit. I don't think this is going to contribute to a shrinking of that budget deficit.
And Johnson, I'm sure you'll agree with me, the other sources of loans, right, apart from the Eurobond itself. So this is a loan that has attracted apparently 323 billion shillings in interest. This is very expensive. So why do you think the government is not going perhaps to alternative sources of loans? Does it mean the Eurobond is easy to get?
First of all, let's put it in context. 323 billion, I think it's over 10 years.
Yes.
That's 32 billion a year. So it doesn't seem like much. My concern is it's not the only loans. Remember, it's just 200 billion. 200 billion, I think we do 195 billion in spending in a month. In a month. So if that was the only source of money, it would be done in just over a month. So for me, the issue is the accumulation of debt, and not just necessarily the Euro debt alone, the Eurobond alone. We've got also a local borrowing here, which has really crowded out the private sector. And the interest, since we keep borrowing to even pay the interest, it compounds.
Yes.
It's the compounding that actually worries me, because I think the debt service we are planning for the year 2018 might be around 600 billion. Not too long ago, it was 200 billion. I remember when the first time we brought it up, it was about 200 billion. So 2014, 2015, thereabouts. You can see the rate of growth is very uncomfortable. We keep this up. If we do keep this up, in no time, and if we don't see any improvement on the real economy, the real economy, then we'll be in trouble. And one of the reasons why I'm not optimistic in seeing this in the real economy is because this went largely to infrastructure spending. Now, I'd love to see that go to factories where actual real jobs are made, where actual real productivity needs to grow, because infrastructure spending just grows productivity around the margins. You're able to transport stuff better, quicker, faster. But we want to see machinery coming in that will boost our productivity from $1,000 per annum to 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000. That is where the money ought to be going. And I'm seeing that all the money is being redirected to infrastructure spending.
Now, this informs the question, Kwame. There's this common term, which people refer to as, Eurobond, Eurobondage, or is it Eurobond trap in Africa?
Yes.
For example, there's a country like Mozambique,
Yes.
Ghana. These are all countries, who have failed to pay, apparently, these loans. And according to analysts, these countries have been forced to humble themselves before IMF. IMF is normally criticized. And apparently, some of them have been forced to borrow other loans to pay this kind of Eurobond loans. So do you think this is a tragedy that not just Kenya is facing, but also most of the African countries?
Okay, let's not conveniently hide behind the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF is not a party to the Eurobond question. We are borrowing as sovereigns. We are going to private banks based in all over the world. And remember, this bond is going to be traded in the London Stock Exchange and the Irish Stock Exchange. Now, what we can do is when we come back here and we are entering into agreements, asking for some facility support from the World Bank and rather from the IMF, only then can they comment by saying, look, your debt position and how much you're paying shows us that there are certain risks that require us to consider those as you engage with us in discourse. So I think it's convenient for us to start arguing IMF and World Bank, but they're not parties to the Eurobond question. They're not, in the sense that when we fail to pay, it's not them who will fail to pay to. What they're concerned is, remember, when President Kibaki left in 2013, 2014, most of the debt, public debt, was owed to us in the sense that it was Kenyans and Kenyan firms and Kenyan banks that we owed. Right now, we've brought it to the point where for every 100 shillings that we owe, I think about 52 or 53 is now to a foreigner. Now, why is that risky? It is risky because when we owe ourselves, we pay from Kenya shillings. If we owe it to, say, a Japanese or a Chinese or an Irish or a US bank, we are paying in dollars. If you look at our exports and the amount of dollars that we are making in Kenya, it's not growing as fast. Actually, the debt is growing faster than our foreign exchange earnings. If you add to that risk, that's the problem. So the IMF and World Bank, I mean the IMF, for instance, and international institutions are not a party to this. They may only come in if we need some facility and budget support over time.
And they raised a red flag before the Parliamentary Budget Committee. I think we're going to play that soundbite shortly. But Johnson, let's talk about the Eurobond back in 2014. That is the Eurobond 1, apparently.
Yes.
And, of course, it was 275 billion Kenyan shillings then. Now, some of the interest for that Eurobond is due for repayment June this year. And it's about 75 billion Kenyan shillings. So the government has gone ahead, solicited for other loans. So do you think the government is right to go ahead and get some more loans before even clearing these other ones?
I don't think we had much of a choice. Like Kwame pointed out, we had some, and I did point out as well, we had some outstanding debt that we needed to pay. A syndicated loan, $750 million. We would also, like Kwame pointed out, we are also in a cash crunch. So the question was how to ease out of that. Because that has already been done. You see, it's a spending. Actually, here the problem is the spending. So if you've already spent, now you need to finance it. If your taxes can't fund it, then you'll need to borrow. So now, what to do going forward? So we've got and you made a good point. There's some 75 million coming through, and even that 323 billion over 10 years is not necessarily accurate. Remember, you have to factor in
fluctuations in the international market
of forex. Yeah, so it might be higher, might be lower. Your bet is as good as mine on why that'll fall. But whether we needed to borrow, like my answer is we needed to. Otherwise, we go into a cash crunch.
So, Kwame, let me ask you one of your favorite questions. How did we get there, actually? Get here, basically. I mean, if you look at tourism as an industry, it's bounced back. There's a lot of foreign exchange coming in. So, why do we keep on saying that the economy is not doing well? Apparently, who is sleeping on the job here?
No, I think it's just, if there's one thing that caused this, it's what we've just discussed. Our spending is far ahead of what our resources in terms of revenue and the growth itself is. So basically, one of the things we need to do is actually cut our spending. So for instance, last year alone, we had a deficit of 8% of GDP. What that means is that we had a budget and the amount of money we intended to spend, and the difference between what we want to spend and the money that we have is equivalent to 8% of the country's GDP. That's unprecedented. And that alone is what has driven this. Because for as long as your spending is well above what you can get in terms of income, you are covering the rest through all manner of loans. And so in the Eurobond, in as much as the Treasury gives the impression that it was a success, the circumstances under which we concluded it suggest to us that we were so desperate for cash that it was actually the buyer's market, not our market. And they got very, very impressive terms compared to us. Remember, Nigeria is in a recession, was in a recession. In November, they got far better terms than we have gotten, and they got more money than we did. So really, we shouldn't sell this. It's suggestion of the fact that we can't make the difficult political decision, which is to bring our expenditure in line with our pocket.
Speaking about politics, Joseph, let me ask you a question that's a little bit political. Apparently, Kenya loses about 600 billion shillings every year through corruption. 30% of Kenya's budget goes to West every year. So with this kind of loans coming in, I mean, how are we even quite sure that it's going to be used for the right purpose?
So you've got a choice. You could have either borrowed and sort that as you go along. And I'm not sure that's going to happen, but that was the one choice. And the other choice was to stop all borrowing and see if you can resolve that. Yeah. No, that would have gone into, I think, would have gone into a recession if we opted to do that. So we really don't have a choice in that matter.
So, Kwame, I mean, most Kenyans are asking, I mean, who are these individuals who are advising the government to go ahead and borrow more and more cash? And you've already outlined some of the dangers we're facing.
Yes. Well, I think in terms of responsibility, we have Parliament. Parliament is the counterparty, or rather, it's Parliament that clears government. I use the word clear in terms of provides the approval for the Treasury to borrow on behalf of the country. So if they're presented with a budget and they can see a deficit of 890 billion as we had last year, and they approve that budget, implicitly they've told the Treasury Secretary and the Central Bank to prepare a mechanism to close that budget, to close that gap through what? Through spending. So while everybody looks at Treasury and you're looking at the executive and saying, where's the president and everything, the real responsibility should lie with Parliament. Why? Because they have a constitutional responsibility under our Article 201 to make sure that we are a solvent country. They are not doing that now. So the first responsibility should be theirs. And so if you ask ourselves who's advising badly, I don't know, but who is sleeping on their job is certainly Parliament.
Speaking of Parliament, those who are saying that Kenya is overrepresented in Parliament and the issue of bloated wage bill, perhaps it's mainly because of Parliament. So do you think the reason as to why the government is also borrowing more and more is because of these kind of representations and perhaps in Parliament?
No. If you look at Parliament's budget relative to the entire budget is
less than 2%.
What is driving government spending is the roles that maybe we have chosen to give them that I think is beyond what they're supposed to do. I think we need to have a candid conversation in this country on what the role of government is. Because once you say, and we keep laughing about this, that we have this mentality of serikali ingilie kati. That is what leads to the spending, because that's the way government gets things done, by allocating budgets for this and that and the other, and creating bureaucracies around this, around certain perceived problems, with a view of trying to solve them, and funding those bureaucracies, and everything explodes. And then, of course, you've got the development budget. But I think for me, the one red flag that I think, if you keep tracking, you will find that is actually very problematic, is our recurrent expenditure. Typically, the recurrent expenditure is usually higher than our tax collections. And I've seen today's budget policy statement, and the estimates are that our recurrent expenditure will be much, much lower than our tax collection. I think that's wrong. If for the last 5 years, the trend has been our recurrent expenditure has been higher than our tax collection, I think we should be honest with ourselves. There's nothing we're doing any different. So the likelihood is that our recurrent expenditure again will be higher than our tax collection. Now the question is what to do about that, because that's one of the areas that we need to tackle.
Now, Kwame, now that we have this huge debt apparently out there, Johnson has clearly indicated about issues to do with tax collection. Apparently, finally, it has to come back to Kenyans, right?
Yes.
The ones who are going to pay this huge amount of loan. So are we going to foresee a situation where taxes are going to be increased, perhaps? And what will that mean for a government that, of course, is subject to election after every 5 years?
Well, I hope not. But we may get to a point where if it gets to a crisis level, especially this year's budget, to me, will be quite instructive. Because if we have another deficit that is as large as it is, then I think that fight is lost. The only way we are going to wind back up is when we have a crisis. Our debtors coming and saying, look, we need our money, we need it now, and we don't have the money, then they'll force us to a discussion that is very, very difficult about how to resolve public sector reforms which are required. So that's the first thing. As Kenyans, we actually need to ask ourselves, it's not enough to be told that we are building new, shiny new railway lines. We are building new, shiny new power or bigger roads and stuff like that.
Yes.
And when we're asking ourselves, fine, are we using the most responsible means of managing resources to pay for those? And secondly, it is not enough to tell us that we have a railway line that we had for 100 years, which we could have improved, but we've built a new one just because it strikes somebody's fancy, and yet it's not showing that return now. So basically, we'll get to a point where we are asking ourselves, and a candid discussion is necessary, about what can government do that it can do well, and when we have money, is every single shilling accounted for? Billions of shillings just fall through the cracks. As we know, the Auditor General every year finds them. So we'll have to go back there. And I hope we can start that discussion much quicker or sooner than to wait for a budget debt